Hi, everyone. So my name is Darren Pilcher. I'm a research scientist with the Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies, the new Cooperative Institute. It was formerly JAZEO until earlier last month. And today I'm going to be presenting a project that just started earlier this year, funded by OAP, to develop seasonal forecasts of ocean acidification in the Bering Sea. Specifically, this is part of the Research to Understand Vulnerability activity area. It's theme 3. And then if you look in the 2010 NOAA research plan and the Alaska chapter, this is specifically addressing the task to develop regional biogeochemical models to predict changes in carbon chemistry at multiple temporal scales. So why the Bering Sea? The Bering Sea is highly vulnerable to OA just because it has naturally cold, very carbon-rich water, so it only takes a little bit of anthropogenic CO2 to push it into a more corrosive state. The Bering Sea is also home to 60% of the total US fish catch by weight, so it's a critical commercial fishery. It's also a very important source of subsistence protein for a lot of Alaskan coastal communities. But when we're looking at OA here, collecting observational data is really a challenge because of the geographic remoteness and just the very harsh winter weather conditions. And so people like me like to turn to models to kind of help fill in some of those gaps left by the observations. And in particular, I like to work with regional models that are linked to global models. Because these regional models tend to work a bit better in more spatially constrained, high-resolution areas like a coastal shelf region. And so that research question, or that task in the OA plan is really asking this question, can we project OA into the future? And so as part of a separate project, we recently did this for projecting OA over the entire 21st century using that regional ocean model to downscale global scale Earth system models shown here in terms of different models and different emission scenarios. And one of the key points that came out of this was that the bottom waters are really the more vulnerable, right? That because of respiration and remineralization at depth and the high productivity in this area, that's the bottom waters that are projected to be corrosive and to emerge really within the next few decades on an annual and average time frame. And so as we've been presenting this at conferences and interacting with the community, sort of the feedback we've gotten is that, this is great, this is really helpful information, but how about shorter time frames, right? What is OA going to be like next year as opposed to 50 years from now? And this is a very different question that we need to use sort of a different technique to address than what's kind of shown here. And so to do this, we wrote a proposal that was funded as part of the data synthesis call to achieve two objectives. One was to actually develop these OA forecasts and then skill test them to say, are we actually gaining any useful information for these? Can the model actually show us something? And the second is to then use this information to develop an OA exposure index that can be included in the annual ecosystem status report. The ESR is a product produced by folks at NOAA Fisheries every year that's essentially a synthesis of all the survey data and model data output from that year that gets sort of a giant assessment of how the ecosystem is doing in the Bering Sea. And then this report gets presented to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which then uses this along with additional information to set the actual quotas, the fishing quotas for the next season. And so what we're planning to do is for these forecasts to assess sort of late summer, early fall bottom water conditions. And we're following a blueprint sort of set out by another ecological indicator, the Bering Sea bottom cold pool, which Al Herman and others have been forecasting for a few years now. You can see in this time series in the bottom right that they have a long model hindcast shown in the blue line of the aerial extent of the bottom cold pool. That's the y-axis from sort of 0 to 100% of the Bering Sea shelf. The black circles are the survey data, so what fisheries actually collected that year, determining the extent of the cold pool. And then the red circles are the forecasts, so sort of what they forecasted the conditions, the extent to be. And the difference being there, right, that the red circles are an atmospheric forecast, so predicting what the atmosphere is going to be like, and the blue line is then running the model with what the atmosphere actually did look like. So you can see, like in 2018, for instance, that there's a large discrepancy there, and that can be related due to sea ice, for instance, which is very difficult to forecast. And so for our project, the first objective is to determine our model forecast skill. We've already done this in hindcast mode for the carbon chemistry, shown here in this plot on the left from a recent paper. However, the forecast, right, being able to forecast this is an entirely different question, is largely an unknown. I've sketched out kind of a chalkboard diagram, X's and O's diagram of what our similar index might look like compared to the previous slide where I showed the cold pool index. Here, the y-axis is the bottom water corrosivity. And you'll note that the black is already things that we've done, whereas the red is what is part of this project. So we already have a 10-year hindcast. We're going to extend this out for another 10 years. And then do some forecasts shown in the X, and then compare in the X's, and then compare them to the survey data in the circles. However, you might note compared to the previous slide that we don't have nearly as much survey data for this. We only have 3 years of shelf-wide survey OA data. We were supposed to go out this year as well, but due to the pandemic, that's now been canceled. So while we do this, a serious challenge is going to be the limited survey data that we have, but we're going to make do with what we have and sort of see within those 3 years at least how well the model is able to do. Our second objective then is to develop an OA indicator for the ecosystem status report. OA is not currently included at all in this report, and so to kind of kick this off this year, we're going to write a noteworthy section in this report that's essentially an introduction to a new in-development indicator, kind of explain OA, show some time series, plots from the models and data. And then the plan is then in subsequent years to have this in annual reoccurring indicator write-up in the ESR that consists of sort of a standardized set of functions. And so whether that will be, kind of this chalkboard diagram, sort of an anomaly plot of what that next year's conditions will be like, that'll be kind of an in-development process. And so for developing this project, our key takeaways, right, is that right now we've been able to project OA in multi-decadal timeframes, but we still need to work a little bit on the seasonal. Our limited data presents a serious challenge for this. But in conjunction with that, we're going to try to use our model information to develop an OA indicator for the ESR, and that really a lot of this work is being done with a stakeholder committee right from the start. So we sort of stood up a stakeholder committee consisting of these entities at the bottom here. We just had our first meeting in July as this project's kicking off. And so they're going to really be providing input into sort of what kind of figures and plots we produce for the ESR, and then sort of what other information we can broadly distribute so that our data products are both useful and accessible to multiple communities. And then so lastly, just to kind of look forward, as I mentioned, we have sort of an issue with limited data. So one thing we want to do is explore some emerging sources of data in the Bering Sea. The problem with using these outright is that they all have pros and cons, right? It's things like the sail drone and the M2 mooring are only at the surface, where really what we're doing is trying to forecast the subsurface. The DBO sites are depth profiles, but they're in the far northern Bering Sea, whereas we're kind of looking more in the eastern Bering Sea. So we want to explore those new data sources. We also really want to look at the connection of HABs moving forward. There's emerging research about the connection between OA and harmful algal blooms, and HABs are really taking off right now in Alaska. And then finally, just as something a little bit different because it's near and dear to me, Also, just OA monitoring in the Great Lakes, right? That if anyone's familiar with the Great Lakes, they're really more closer to small oceans than lakes. And as such, we expect them to acidify like the oceans. However, we really don't have the data to show this yet. We don't have any OA monitoring in the Great Lakes right now. And so I think there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit there to address some very basic questions about sort of where we think the Great Lakes are going, and even just questions in regards to whether they are an annual sink or source of carbon. There's still a lot of unresolved issues there. And with that, I will stop.